Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little. I'm here today with the 110th episode of Weekly Poker Hand. I want to thank you for being here with me today. Today I have a hand from a $2,000 buy-in deep stack tournament. So we have deeper stacks than normal. Blinds are 2,000, 4,000 with a 500 ante, and I have 250,000 in the hijack seat. So let's take a look. We get pocket fives. Not a great hand, but certainly acceptable. So they fold to me in the hijack, and I'm going to raise. I make it 8,000 in this hand, but I typically want to make it a little bit bigger in today's game, and that's just because I think people defend the big blind better. And if you told me before this hand that there's a good loose aggressive kid in the big blind, I would have raised to 10,000, because you want to do everything you can to discourage him from calling. If you give him incredibly good pot odds, him folding is a pretty big error. And most loose aggressive people do not fold, so that kind of implies that you are inducing him to play well. And you never want to induce your opponents to play well. You want to induce them to make mistakes. So, loose aggressive kid does call in the big blind, as expected. Wouldn't be much of a hand if he folded. Flop comes ace-9-2. So my opponent checks. And in this spot, I think we can go either way, between betting or checking. If we're betting, the primary reason for betting is we want to make hands like king high, queen high, jack high, 8 high, etc. We want all of these hands to fold, because if it goes check-check on the flop, we have to assume the loose aggressive kid is going to be capable of being capable of betting the turn and the river to try to get us off of all of our, quote unquote, obvious non-ace hands. And you will find that when most people check back on the flop, they usually either have a bad ace or a marginal made hand, and that is exactly what I have. So if I don't want to look like I have those hands, I typically want to be betting. I would be checking back here with hands like ace-3, ace-4, ace-5, pocket kings, pocket queens, pocket jacks. Those are pretty good hands to check. I think the lower pairs, especially hands that contain a 2 for bottom pair, and hands like mine, a 5, are pretty good hands to bet, because we are not going to be able to play very well if we check behind and face a bet. So I do bet 7,000. Notice you don't need to bet too large on this ace-9-2. What's going to happen a lot of the time is your opponent's going to stick around with a kind of junky range, and that allows you to put money in, on average, not so bad on this flop. I mean, we could even be a favorite whenever we put in 7,000. Whereas if we bet something like 14,000 on the flop, we're going to be putting our money in pretty far behind. So this is a scenario where we want to bet very small with our whole range. Notice if we have an ace, we really want our opponents to call, and if you start betting 14,000 again, your opponent's going to start folding out a lot of junk. So I do bet 7,000, my opponent calls. Turn is a 10 of diamonds, not a good card for me. Opponent checks, and at this point, I'm never going to make my opponent fold an ace. Loose aggressive kid is not going to fold a 9 for at least one more bet, so I either need to bet the turn and the river to try to make my opponent fold perhaps bad aces and worse, or I just need to check behind and try to get closer to showdown and try to beat king high and queen high and just random junk. So I would not hate turning this exact hand into a bluff, but I think checking is also fine. So it does go check-check on the turn. River is a 10. So ace-9 to 10-10. And our opponent bets 16,500 into the 36,500 pots. And I think this is normally a spot where you're going to want to fold, unless you think your opponent could check call the flop with a really wide range, perhaps all sorts of stuff, like maybe any 2 cards that are a 9 or higher than a 9 on the flop, like king, queen, king, jack, king 10, queen, jack, queen 10, etc. So if we think he's going to have a lot of those hands, we should probably call. Obviously, we lose to all those that have a 10, but we also do beat all the unpaired ones. Also, some players will check call the flop with a hand like pocket 4s or 3s and then decide to turn it into a bluff on the river to try to get me off of 5s, 6s, 7s, and 8s. So I don't really love this spot, but all things considered, especially the fact that my opponent is a good loose aggressive kid, which kind of implies he is capable of turning marginal made hands into a bluff, I think I do need to make the reluctant call. And that is what I do. And my opponent just mucks, so I win. He probably had something like queen jack and decided to check call the flop. You would think your opponent would have shown his hand if he had king high, because maybe that's good 1 in a million times. But, kind of an interesting spot where the opponent clearly decided to turn some marginal junk into a bluff, and it worked out. I think a lot of players in my shoes somewhat mindlessly fold in this spot when they face a river bet. And you have to make sure you are not necessarily doing that every time. I do think folding is a good play versus most opponents in this scenario, but against someone who I think is a good loose aggressive kid, that may not necessarily be the case, especially if you pick up some sort of a live read. If you have a live read on a guy that makes you think that he is just completely bluffing every time, then obviously you cannot fold. So, kind of a fun spot. I'm not trying to call here too often, but you have to realize when you check behind on the turn, you have induced your opponent to bluff. So if you've induced your opponent to bluff, you shouldn't really be looking to fold too often, even if it is a somewhat substantial pot. So that's going to be it for this episode of Weekly Poker Hand. If you have not already, I strongly suggest you check out my interactive poker training program over at pokercoaching.com. There we have interactive quizzes, in-depth homework questions, and I will answer all of your homework questions personally. So if you want that, check it out at pokercoaching.com. Thank you very much for being here with me today for Weekly Poker Hand, and I will talk to you next week.